History remembers what it wants. It remembers wars carved into stone, crowns lifted high, and empires burning brightly before they fell. But some truths were buried deeper than ruins. They happened behind temple doors, where incense thickened the air, where silence was enforced by fear, and where the gods were said to demand more than prayer. These were rituals not meant for outsiders. Rituals later generations found so disturbing. They tried to erase them completely, not because they were false, but because they were real. Tonight, we step into that silence. To the ancient world, gods were not distant ideas. They were forces, capricious, demanding, and easily angered. Harvests failed when they were ignored. Plagues followed disrespect. Empires believed survival depended on obedience, and obedience was not always symbolic. In certain temples, devotion meant surrender of time, of body, of choice. These acts were not called shameful. They were called necessary. In Mesopotamia, one goddess ruled desire itself. Inanna, later called Ishtar, she was love and war, fertility and destruction. Her temples were powerful institutions, and her priesthood answered only to her. To serve Inanna was to serve the state and the divine at once. And some offerings went far beyond grain or gold. Young women were chosen early. Some were daughters of elite families, others offered by parents seeking favor. They were trained, educated, purified, and told their service was sacred. To refuse would dishonor their family. To resist would offend the goddess herself. The temple became their world, and escape was unthinkable. These acts were never described as pleasure. They were transactions between mortals and gods, between power and submission. The ritual was believed to renew fertility, to bless the city, to keep chaos at bay. Faith was the justification. Silence was the price. What happened when someone said no? Records are quiet, but silence often speaks loudest. Refusal meant exile, loss of status, sometimes disappearance. The gods, after all, could not be denied. If this history unsettles you, that is exactly why it was hidden. Later civilizations rewrote these rituals as myth, or erased them completely, because acknowledging them meant admitting how power once ruled faith itself. If you want more stories history tried to silence, subscribe now to Boring Histories. What comes next only grows darker. Babylon refined the ritual. Here, devotion became structured, regulated, ritualized, and forced. Once in a lifetime, some women were required to attend the temple of Ishtar and wait, not to choose, but to be chosen. It was law disguised as worship. Greek travelers wrote of these customs with horror. They did not understand them, or perhaps feared them. To outsiders, these rites seemed unthinkable. To those inside the system, they were simply life. Perspective determined morality. Along the Nile, sexuality took another form, not transactional, but cosmic. Creation myths described gods forming the universe. Through intimate acts, fertility was divine, and temples reflected that belief. Egyptian priestesses were not partners, they were vessels, believed to channel divine force. Their bodies symbolized continuity, order, and rebirth. Private rituals reinforced public stability. Across civilizations, a pattern emerges. Rituals always served power. Kings endorsed them, priests enforced them, gods justified them. Faith became governance. Empires rose, empires fell, and slowly, doubt crept in. New religions arrived, declaring these rituals sinful, dangerous, corrupt. What was once sacred became forbidden. Records were destroyed, priesthoods dissolved, stories changed. The rituals did not vanish, they were buried, and silence replaced truth. Yet fragments survived, carvings, foreign accounts, whispers and myth, enough to remind us, history is not always written by the righteous. Sometimes, it is written by those who were most afraid of the truth. And this is only the beginning. In Babylon, ritual was not optional. It was structured into law. Temple duty became civic duty, a responsibility wrapped in divine language. What appeared sacred on the surface was enforced through social pressure. Beneath it, the gods did not need chains. Belief was enough. Babylon did not hide these rituals. They existed in plain sight, yet no one spoke of them openly. The city watched, the city knew, and the city remained silent. Because silence kept order, women were not the only ones drawn into ritual obligation. In certain rites, men too were chosen, often young, often powerless. Sacred texts speak carefully here, but implication lingers. The gods demanded balance. Greek writers struggled to describe what they saw. Herodotus recorded these customs with discomfort, half disbelief, half condemnation. To him, Babylon was excessive, dangerous, yet even his words survive, only because later historians allowed them to. As centuries passed, truth softened. Rituals became stories, obligations became symbols, myth became a shield, protecting future generations from uncomfortable realities. Egypt followed another philosophy. Here, sex was not transactional, it was cosmic. Creation myths spoke of gods birthing the universe through union. To understand ritual in Egypt is to understand balance. Pharaohs were not merely rulers, they were gods in flesh. Their bodies symbolized order itself, and what sustained order was not conquest, but continuity. Temple priestesses were guardians of Maat, cosmic harmony. Their rituals were private, their roles absolute. To them, intimacy was not desire, it was responsibility. Certain festivals allowed sacred boundaries to soften. Music, dance, symbolic union, not indulgence, but renewal. When Romans entered Egypt, they were disturbed. What they could not control, they labeled immoral. What they could not reshape, they planned to erase. Greece inherited fragments, not rituals, but echoes. Sacred sexuality existed, yet was tightly contained, hidden behind philosophy. Some Greek temples employed attendants, whose roles remained deliberately vague. Later historians softened the language, but ambiguity remains. Greek thinkers reframed ritual into metaphor. The body became secondary, the mind supreme. It was not liberation, it was containment. As philosophy rose, women vanished from records, their roles reduced, their rituals unspoken. Silence returned. What was once sacred became shameful. What was duty became sin, and history adjusted accordingly. Rome did not tolerate ambiguity. Rituals that threatened control were outlawed, temples closed, priests punished, faith was reorganized. Former priestesses became villains, old gods became demons. The past was rewritten to justify the present. Centuries passed. What remained were fragments, misunderstood, misrepresented, yet not gone. Modern scholars hesitate, not because evidence is lacking, but because conclusions are uncomfortable. Truth disrupts narratives. The rituals did not disappear, they were buried beneath morality, law, and fear. And in the next chapter, Rome finishes the erasure. Rome feared chaos more than cruelty. Anything that threatened hierarchy, anything that blurred power, was dangerous. Foreign rituals unsettled Roman control. Ambiguity invited rebellion, and Rome did not tolerate ambiguity. In 186 BCE, Rome panicked. The Bacchanalia, secret rites honoring Bacchus, spread through Italy. They were private, mixed gender, unregulated. To Rome, secrecy itself was the crime. Rome reframed fear as virtue. The Senate declared the rites immoral, dangerous, corrupting. Morality became a tool, not to protect people, but to protect power. Shrines were closed, altars dismantled, priesthoods dissolved. Centuries of belief erased. With official seals and iron locks, punishment went beyond bodies. It targeted memory. Names were struck from records, statues defaced, stories forbidden. Rome understood one truth well: control the past, and you control the future. Former priestesses vanished. Some were absorbed into ordinary life. Others were punished. Their sacred role, once protected by gods, now marked them as threats. What was once holy became illegal. What was once duty became shame. Law replaced belief. As Christianity spread, the divide hardened. Old rituals were not merely outlawed, they were demonized. Former gods became devils. Former rites became sins. Texts change tone. Words, once neutral, became accusatory. History learned to whisper. Fear dressed itself as holiness. Control wore the mask of virtue, and silence became sacred. Centuries later, only fragments remained. Without context, rituals looked monstrous. Without explanation, they looked depraved. History judged what it no longer understood. As narratives narrowed, women disappeared, their roles minimized, their agency erased. They became footnotes, or warnings. Those who wrote history declared themselves righteous. Those erased were declared corrupt. Power decided truth. Yet archaeology remembers. Stone does not lie, it only waits. What if these rituals were not excess, but systems? What if faith was engineered? What if silence protected power? What is sacred today may be condemned tomorrow. Morality shifts with power. Erasing rituals did not erase control, it simply changed its language. Fragments survive despite suppression. In myths, in ruins, in uncomfortable footnotes. Truth does not vanish easily. We inherited the silence and learned to call it history. In the final act, we confront what remains, not rituals, but consequences. By late antiquity, the work was done. The rituals were no longer debated. They were condemned, not questioned, but forgotten on purpose. Silence was no longer accidental. It was policy. Stories survived, but only as cautionary tales. Priestesses became seductresses. Rituals became decadence. Complex systems were reduced to moral warnings for future generations. Without context, meaning collapses. Ritual without explanation looks like excess. Duty without belief looks like exploitation. History judged what it refused to understand. Women became symbols. Temptation, corruption, sin. Their voices were erased. Their intentions overwritten. The human story disappeared. What replaced the rituals was not freedom, it was control. With new language, authority shifted, but obedience remained. Not all memory vanished. Some families whispered stories. Some stones refused silence. Truth endured quietly. Centuries later, the earth began to answer. Excavations uncovered what texts denied. Stone remembered what ink forgot. Evidence forced questions, but conclusions made people uncomfortable. So language softened, terms blurred, implications avoided. What if ritual was governance? What if belief was infrastructure? What if intimacy was weaponized by the sacred? Erasure did not purify belief, it narrowed it. Faith lost complexity and gained fear. History became safer and smaller. Whole systems vanished. From collective memory, women paid the highest price. From central figures to moral footnotes, from sacred agents to silent shadows, modern morality inherited conclusions, not evidence, judgment, without context, because power still hides behind morality, because silence still protects authority, because history still chooses what to forget. We stand at the edge of truth, not to glorify the past, but to understand it. Truth is rarely gentle, and history was never meant to comfort us. We can look away, or look deeper. Only one veil remains: fear of knowing. The final truth is not about ritual, it is about power. What happens next cannot be buried again. Centuries of silence end here. Yet even now, whispers remain. Fragments of rituals, stories of devotion, traces of women once central to sacred power. The past cannot fully be silenced. Each stone, each carving, carries the weight of forgotten stories. The silence is heavy, the past is oppressive, and yet, it demands remembrance. Do not mistake ritual for abstraction. These were human lives. Fear, devotion, agency, coercion, they all existed here. We are heirs of that complexity. Archaeology offers fragments. Text offers fragments. Myth offers fragments. Together, they form a mosaic of what history almost buried. Power feared what it could not control. Society feared what it could not justify. Faith and fear intertwined, and women silent, invisible carried it all. Their names are lost, their voices almost gone, Yet echoes remain in architecture, in myth, in memory. By remembering, we reclaim narrative. By studying, we honor truth. By facing discomfort, we acknowledge the human cost. What was once immoral may have been political. What was once shameful may have been sacred. Erasing history erases context. Erasing context erases empathy, and the echoes of that loss remain with us today. Amid fear, devotion, and power, humanity persisted. Even in silence, stories survived. Quietly, persistently. To forget is dangerous. To forget is to let fear rewrite morality. To forget is to let silence govern. We reflect not to shame, but to understand. Not to condemn, but to learn. History is not entertainment. It is instruction. Every erased ritual, every silenced voice, teaches us about power, fear, and survival. The past is not static. What we choose to uncover shapes what we understand about humanity. The forbidden temple rituals of the ancient world were not merely acts, they were systems of power, faith, and fear. Now, they speak again. Through ruins, myths, and the fragments, we can still see. If you want more shocking history like this, subscribe to Boring Histories. Like, comment, and share your thoughts. History is never silent. Only those who refuse to listen are.